This is your Irish Diary, presenting the romance and reality of Irish life then and now. Áuric Éireann, or Irish Diary, is presented by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation of St. Paul. Professor John McKiernan of the College of St. Thomas in St. Paul is writer and narrator.
For many people, this man represented the growth of a new departure, but for many he was the continuation of a tradition. It may be of some interest for you to know that 25%, at least, of the American presidents have been of Irish ancestry. I'm not going to labor that. I'm a little bit dubious myself about how long traditions can continue as operating influences in any family. But at least the figure remains, and we do have an illustration from Kennedy's own life that some fond recollection of Ireland was still operative in his background. But if you'll allow me to take you back a few years to the Revolutionary War, I'd like to read to you a statement that was made in the British Parliament in 1784. And it's to be found, if you'd like to look it up in its full length, it's to be found in the published parliamentary debates. April 2nd, 1784. Gardiner, Luke Gardiner, who was afterwards Lord Mountjoy, said this: "America was lost by Irish immigrants. These immigrations are fresh in the recollection of every gentleman in this House. I am assured, from the best authority, the major part of the American army was composed of Irish, and that the Irish language was as commonly spoken in the American ranks as English." Well, at least it's something to reflect about, isn't it? I'm not here to suggest that it's true word for word. At least it is the report of a man who believed that he was supplied with the very best authority. But now, to continue this line of inquiry and to show you the tradition that I mentioned in connection with Mr. Kennedy, that is, that Mr. Kennedy is himself not only a new departure in politics in the sense that a Catholic was elected President of the United States, but he himself was also one of a fairly significant number of people who, before him, were of Irish ancestry and became the chief executives of this land. So in order to put that in its proper context, I'd like to transport you to the City Hall in Philadelphia, where you may read a plaque, very interestingly worded indeed, in commemoration of the men of Irish birth or lineage, a few of whose names are here included, who risked their lives and fortunes for America in the Revolution. Now, if you have very keen eyesight, you might be able to identify some of the names. It would be really too boring for you if I were to read them all, but I'd like to pick out a few of them, and more particularly perhaps those who were born in Ireland rather than in America, though I'll give you a few of the both. Thomas McKeon, for instance, who was the son of William and Letitia McKean of County Derry. Now, he was first generation American, but his parents came from Derry, and he himself was later governor of Pennsylvania and one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Here is another first generation American, George Reed, the son of John Reed from Dublin. And this man, George, helped make Delaware the first state to ratify the Constitution. Well, if we begin to look at some who were born in Ireland, we have Edward Rutledge, one of the signers of the Declaration again, a man who himself was born in Ireland, whose brother was chairman of the committee that drafted the Constitution. Edward Rutledge. It doesn't sound like an Irish name, but then there's a story about how Irish names got that way, and indeed Rutledges, at least some Rutledges, had for their name originally in Ireland Mulderig. Edward Rutledge, whom you see before you, later became governor of South Carolina and was Irish born. James Smith, likewise a signer of the Declaration, likewise Irish born, born in Dublin. And one might ask, well, isn't Smith an English name or a German name possibly? Yes, I suppose Smiths are to be found in every country. And we know that in Ireland, the original form of the name Smith was MacGowan, which of course is an occupational name, Smith. So that whether his name was originally MacGowan or not, we don't know, but he was born in Dublin. Another of the signers, George Taylor, another of the Irish-born signers of the Declaration of Independence, a man who had a very distinguished career, a member of the Pennsylvania Assembly, a county judge, an officer in the Pennsylvania militia, a delegate to the Continental Congress, and so on. And another Irish-born signatory is Matthew Thornton, born in Limerick, an army surgeon during the French and Indian Wars, and a man who held several political posts in New Hampshire before and after, too, his term in the Continental Congress. And then a very influential man, Charles Thomson, born in Derry. This man, one of the most interesting of all of these, the secretary to the Continental Congress. And everyone from that period pays great tribute to this man. The Declaration, when it was in his handwriting, and on another occasion, fulfilling another post in our government, he was the moving spirit in the committee that obtained the design for the Great Seal of the United States. So those were people who signed the Declaration, for the most part, had been born in Ireland. We find when we turn to the Army and Navy signatories, we find now a man, Edward Hand. Again, one of those interesting names, and we say to ourselves, well, now, is that Irish? But many of the people whose name is Hand, many of them had for an Irish name Lavin, or what is more frequently anglicized, Lavin. So Edward Hand, whether his name was originally Lavin or Lavin or not, I don't know, but he was born in what used to be called Kings County and now has reverted to the older name Offaly. He was a colonel and adjutant general. And General William Irvine was born in County Fermanagh, who had studied medicine in Ireland indeed, and had practiced it, as a matter of fact, in Carlisle, Pennsylvania before the war, and became a general in the Continental Army. And then we have this man, General Andrew Lewis. I've taken this, chosen to give you a little variety in photographs, and here is a picture of his statue, which is in Richmond, Virginia. He came here as a boy and grew up to be one of the leading frontier Indian fighters, had been born in County Donegal. And another Donegal man, General Richard Montgomery, who was most beloved of Washington, born, we believe, in Raphoe in Donegal, although there's another account that disputes this and says possibly Swords in Dublin. But he was killed in the assault on Quebec and was a great loss to the army. And Colonel Stephen Moylan, a good Cork man who was aide-de-camp to Washington. And then we have another Donegal man, Colonel Walter Stewart of the Pennsylvania line. And in this list of Irish-born generals, In the Army, we have Major General John Sullivan, who I must confess was actually American-born, but the son of John Sullivan of Limerick and Marjorie Sullivan of Cork. And though he was not Irish-born, I put him here because he was later the chief executive of New Hampshire, and his children were particularly distinguished in colonial and later in our early national period history. And then we have Commodore John Barry, the father of the American Navy. You all know of him, I think. Now, this is an extraordinary list of signers of the Declaration and of generals in the Army and of Commodore John Barry, and we could have told you about the O'Briens from Maine, who were also great naval names, all who had been born in Ireland. Now, I prefaced it by this remark of Lord Mountjoy. I'd like to sandwich all of this with another remark, this time from an Irish leader, to contrast it with Lord Mountjoy's remark. And Henry Grattan, the great Irish parliamentary leader of the end of the 18th century, said these stirring words: "America is the only hope of Ireland and the only refuge of mankind." Now, what is there, this connection between America and Ireland, that makes a man stand up in British Parliament and blame the American Revolution on the Irish, and makes an Irish parliamentary leader stand up in Dublin and say that America is the only hope of Ireland and the only refuge of mankind? It was, of course, the fact that immediately in Ireland, Ireland at that moment was experiencing one of its continuous, if you will, but ever-recurring demands for national freedom. That was the immediate thing. But then in the remote, for the previous century or two, people had been fleeing Ireland to go to the security of America. In the 17th century, for instance, that's fairly early, in 1680, in Maryland, there was a tract of 8,000 square miles called New Ireland. New Ireland. And in 1684, Lord Baltimore subdivided this into three sections, one called New Leinster, New Munster, and New Connacht, naming them after three of the four provinces of Ireland, Ulster being the only one that was omitted from that. Then beginning in the 18th century, we can pick up, these are just scattered facts to illustrate the fact that the Irish had been coming during the 17th and the 18th. And at the beginning of the 18th century in the South Carolinas, we come across a 12,000 acre plantation called Limerick Plantation, bought by a man by the name of Mahan, which is certainly a name one can find around Limerick and Clare. And then when we come to Pennsylvania, we know Pennsylvania was the most Irish of all of the colonies. Isn't that interesting? We might think today that it must have been Massachusetts, but Massachusetts was more English than Irish at that time. But Pennsylvania now, when we come to Pennsylvania, we find other evidence of the growing Irish numbers there. In 1746, for instance, Governor Thomas ordered an expedition. He ordered that 400 men be raised for an expedition to Canada. And when this was done, the birthplace of each man was recorded, and we find that 55% of the men were born in Ireland. So it illustrates something about Pennsylvania, and maybe since we said Pennsylvania was the most Irish, maybe we ought to give another example. In 1758, for instance, when the so-called Pennsylvania Regiment was raised for the French and Indian War, there were 20 companies in that regiment, and some companies had as many as 94% of its personnel born in Ireland. None of them had any less than 26%, and the average for the entire regiment was 44.5% of the personnel born in Ireland. And let me see, I think it was about 28% born in America, and 10% born in Germany, 10% born in England, and 3.5% in Scotland, and about 1.5% in Wales. So it might be some indication of the population of the county. Now, we've already shown, in other words, that before the Revolution, and certainly during that century of the Revolution, that there were tremendous numbers of Irish here. Now, I'm not banking all of this on Lord Mountjoy's statement, because I think that since the Revolution went against England, that many of the English were a bit too quick to blame or credit the Irish for having had too large a part in it. And I don't think we want to take at face value their figures. But the signatories to the Declaration, the generals in the army, as well as the personnel, I've just mentioned that strong proportion of personnel in the various armies, and incidentally in the Continental Army, it's been estimated, I think fairly conservatively, that about 38% of the personnel was from Ireland. So all of this illustrates the fact that they were here in large numbers, and they were participating in the national life. One further check upon this. If we take the, what do you call this, Philadelphia and the New York Customs House Registry of vessels clearing the port, either coming into it from a foreign country or leaving it for a foreign country, and if we take that period immediately before the Revolution, 1771 to 1774, in that 3-year period, 576 vessels either came from Ireland or left for Ireland from Philadelphia and New York. This doesn't count any of the rest of the coast, and we know the Irish were in other colonies too. But 576 of these vessels. And the port of call, we note that 135 of them either went to or came from Cork, 124 to Dublin, Londonderry 96, Belfast 39, so that we know, you see, that all over, this wasn't people coming from one part of Ireland, but they were coming from all over. They were, in other words, Catholics, they were Protestants, they were Northerners, they were Southerners, Easterners and Westerners. They were from the entire country, so that when we look into this period of American history, we find a significantly large Irish, Protestant and Irish Catholic contribution made in many, many fields. But now I'd like to illustrate for you the connections this has with the American presidency, because many of our presidents had as ancestors people who had been born in Ireland. And this might be of some interest, particularly in view of Mr. Kennedy's accession to that particular responsibility a short while ago. Andrew Jackson, for instance, is such a representative. Andrew Jackson, we certainly have brilliant, or should I say fond or vivid recollections of this man. In our American history, he was a colorful figure. We don't have anything to show of his house, but this is the general area, if you will. This is Carrickfergus Castle, midway between Belfast and Larne, on the northern shore of Belfast. And that would give you some idea of the general area, but unfortunately the house has been torn down. James Knox Polk was descended from people who came from the Londonderry area, or it's perhaps more commonly called the Derry area. But whereas Andrew Jackson's mother and father had come from Ireland, this man is the great-great-great-grandchild of a Northern Irishman who came here in the year 1680. And then we have James Buchanan, father of the 15th president, whom you see, who immigrated to Philadelphia from his maternal grandmother's home in County Donegal. There is something of a relic, you might say. This is not their original house, but this house stands on the site of their family home. That's all we can say about anything in connection with the actual family. But the 17th president, Andrew Johnson, came from a family who originated near Larne in County Antrim, and who immigrated to America about 1750. Now, Johnson is an interesting name because it can be English or Scottish or possibly we should say Swedish, Norwegian, Scandinavian at any rate. But there is a family of Irish Johnsons because the Johnson in that case represents a translation from the Gaelic Maceoin, and Mac meaning son, and Owen John. So John son Maceoin. But we don't connect him with this particular family, but it reminds us of that. Now there's a cottage at Mount Hill, completely in ruins, you can see, and this was associated with the Johnson family. The next president is, whom we'll mention to you, is Chester Alan Arthur, the 21st president of the United States. And it was his grandfather, Alan Arthur, who migrated to Vermont in 1816 with his son William, who became a clergyman and then became the father of the president. And there is a house of theirs at Dreen, which is the Arthur homestead. And finally, as we come to a more modern period, and we have William McKinley, the 25th president. He was the great-great-great-grandson of James McKinley, who about 1743 immigrated to America from County Antrim also. And there's a dwelling house that is associated with the McKinleys, which you see here before you now. And coming even closer, of course, we have Woodrow Wilson, our 28th president, whose homestead was in County Tyrone near Strabane. And in this instance, we also have a Wilson, there is at least a Wilson living in this homestead yet. Now, these are some of the previous presidents, and when we come to our most recent but one president, President Kennedy, we associate him now on several levels with a great achievement politically, that is, as a Catholic, he got into the White House. That White House is something that's also associated with the presidents, if you will, because it was reputedly taken from the Leinster House in Dublin, taken from the Leinster House, which was the home of the Fitzgeralds. And the White House itself, you all know, was designed by James Hoban, who was an Irish-born architect who won a competition here, a competition in designing, and modeled the certain features, the more prominent features of the White House on the Fitzgerald home in Dublin, which is called the Leinster House. It's now the Parliament, or the meeting place of the Irish Parliament. So when John Fitzgerald Kennedy visited Ireland, he did joke about that in addressing the Irish Parliament. He reminded them that after all, he was only returning to the Fitzgerald House. And he also reminded them that it was very foresighted of James Hoban to have designed the White House in Washington from the features of the old Fitzgerald home, looking forward to the time when a John Fitzgerald Kennedy might occupy it. Well, now, what have we done in the course of this brief time? But reminded ourselves of the very evident and very real connection in American history, the connection with Ireland. Sympathetically, the Irish have always looked to America as a place of refuge. Of course, we know that the rest of the world did that, and the sign on the Statue of Liberty reminds us of it. But we know they came here in the 17th century. They indeed came here in the 16th, but we know they came in the 17th century, and they came in the 18th century, and they came in the 19th century. The Fitzgerald Kennedys, of course, coming in the 19th century. And we know that they were Protestant and Catholic, and we know they came from all parts of Ireland, north, south, east, west. Why did they come? And why did they take such a vigorous part in the military life of this country, forming such a large bulk of the Revolutionary Army? Why? Simply because at home they were suffering the persecution of a foreign government. Their own destiny was not in their own hands, and although many remained behind to endure and to suffer, many left. And we had, from leaving from ports in Ireland that are no longer used as ports, we had, leaving from these ports, thousands and thousands of people coming here, Catholic and Protestant, to start a new life. Now, as we know from the history of America, and as you know from, well, if you do any current reading, and who doesn't, you know that up until the time of Kennedy, a Catholic could not be elected the president or to the presidency. And therefore, the Irish Catholics in the past, although they had some flair for politics, spent that energy on levels lower than the presidency. But the Irish Protestants, with that same, shall we use the word Celtic? I don't like it. That same Celtic energy were able to climb to some of the highest ranks in the country. Now, maybe that's being unfair. Maybe that's crediting them with too much, since in many instances it was a grandson or a great-grandson. So really, I'm not going to enter into the argument about how long an influence remains operative in a family. And I'm content, I think, simply to put it on this level, that at least on their paternal side, at least 25% of our presidents have had Irish ancestry. Whereas, if we were to include the maternal side as well, we should have to boost that to 30% or a little bit over. It's an interesting story, at any rate, and an interesting connection stretching across the sea.
If you would like a list of selected readings to add to your enjoyment, please send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Professor John McKiernan, College of St. Thomas, St. Paul, Minnesota. This program has been presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation and produced at KTCA TV, Minneapolis, St. Paul.